Good morning, everyone. Now, really looking forward to this session, and as our panel gets mic'd up, I'll just maybe set the scene a little bit for what's coming up. So I'm Geoff Dooley, 2003 scholar, and listening to the presentations this morning, indeed Joe's opening as well, very much reminded of the study I undertook in 2003. It was entitled Bioenergy, Empowering Farmers in a Globalized Economy. And at that time I was really intrigued, I suppose, about the potential for agriculture to explore new markets, solving complex challenges through renewable energy. I had a particular interest in the bioethanol industry in North America. And maybe picking up on Joe's opening as well about net positive solutions, I think some of our solutions can also be net negative. And there are certain contexts, I think, in which biofuels can be net negative. And that's something that I learned, and it's something that we might take forward into this session as well. So we have a wonderful topic this morning, moving way beyond greenwashing, developing solutions for a net positive agriculture. And I think as Catherine Lascarette mentioned to me during the week, there's so much packed into that topic, you just know it was put together by a committee. We should also remember that the topic is centered on and I think there's no probably about it, the key challenge of our time. And that is, I think, aligning humanity with reality. Because we're struggling to align with reality. And if there's one thing we know for sure, it is that reality will have its way with us regardless. That's guaranteed. So there are a number of, I think, maybe anchor points, we might call them, in the topic. And it might be just worth paying attention to them, earmarking them, because they will guide us through the dialogue that's going to follow. The first word, I think, is important. It's moving. And moving signifies a shift in position. And my experience is that activity is not necessarily the same thing as moving. Sometimes we can get, caught repeating old patterns, maybe doing that with increased vigor even, but there isn't any movement. So maybe we should just pay a little bit of attention to that, not to conflate movement and activity. Now, the second anchor, I believe, of course, is the word greenwashing. And greenwashing is a trigger word certainly for environmentalists, and it certainly should be for all of us. It comes in many guises, and I think it's important to be alert for it. I suppose the most obvious one would be situations of outright deception. Perhaps the most egregious example might be the Volkswagen emission scandal, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. But it comes in other guises as well, such as having a lofty environmental target, but there isn't a clear or credible plan for achieving it. And actually, Joe Leonard referenced that in the context of agriculture in his opening this morning. We know where we want to get to, but is there a credible plan for getting there? There's a question mark about that. Maybe another example might be, when an organization or a sector might bask in the warm afterglow of some niche project, but it really only represents a tiny part of what they do. ExxonMobil promoting its Algate biofuels project might be an example, given that 98% of its portfolio is based on fossil fuels. And the third anchor that we want to focus on is solutions. And solutions, of course, is very interesting, but we must also ask ourselves, solutions to what problem? And it can be very tempting to jump to solutions without a proper diagnosis of the problem. And badly designed solutions can actually make things worse, which is something we must keep in mind. There's an old saying that a problem well articulated is already half solved. So in terms of thinking about solutions, let's not lose sight of the problem. And also let's be wary of the temptation to jump to the solution that we want to offer without perhaps having given careful consideration to what's actually needed. And that's a question, I think, for the room this morning. What does the world need from farmers today? And maybe that's a starting point for us. As Peter Drucker observed, Peter Drucker is a famous guy from Harvard, and he observed once that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, but it is to act with yesterday's logic. So again, there's a question, where does our logic, where does our frame of reference date from? There's an element there of considering our own baseline, which is something we can carry into this discussion. The fourth anchor on our topic it's just a lovely concept of net positive agriculture. And this suggests, or perhaps the ask is, that agriculture will provide solutions that contribute more to solving problems than it does to creating them. And then we're back into this net positive, net negative idea again. So it's a lovely concept for sure. It's a lovely thing to go for, but we do need to be careful with it. It's risky. It's a wonderful invitation to make greenwashed claims of virtue that don't stack up. So let's check ourselves for that and see how it progresses. And we're left with decisions as well as to who gets to decide what is net positive anyway. But again, we're back to that fact that ultimately reality will decide, because reality is going to determine our future and our welfare one way or another. So there's a real sense in which the stakes could not be higher, nor our responsibility greater. And I am thrilled to be joined with this morning's panel to address this question and this topic. We have Helen Sheridan, Associate Professor of Agricultural Ecology at UCD. We have Thomas Duffy. Thomas is a dairy farmer. He is Vice President of CEJA, which is the European Council of Young Farmers. We have Gillian O'Sullivan, a dairy farmer and a veterinarian. And we have Kieran Duggan, a farmer and an environmentalist. And zooming in, I'm expecting we'll have Kevin Burkum as well from the Global Dairy Platform. Kevin is in Wisconsin, so it'll be very, very early in the morning for him. And so I'm hoping that, and I think he's zooming in, so thank you, Alex. He'll be with us this morning as well. It's worth noting that we had, and on your programs you'll have seen that Oisin Coughlan, Executive Director of Friends of the Earth, was to join us. And I had an email from Oisin yesterday to say that he's come down with a virus and he's under doctor's orders to not to circulate and to desist from further activity. So, to a certain extent, we were bringing Oisin to the room this morning to provide that edge and tension, to provide that stretch to our dialogue that would enable us to be more creative. So today, actually, that responsibility now falls on all of the room. What we've also done, and we knew Kieran Duggan was going to be in the room, we've asked Kieran to join the panel at very late notice, and also to help us carry that responsibility of providing that stretch in terms of ensuring that a broad range of perspectives are represented here. So the panel will share their perspectives on the subject. And let's bear in mind that this is a subject that polarizes people into different positions. And the difficulty and the real challenge with being polarized or locked in is that it makes movement very difficult. We can build, quite solid walls for ourselves as we defend a position, and that's perhaps not what's needed right now. And the truth is, and I think everybody in this room, particularly the Nuffield organisation, I think will be well tuned into this, that any organisation, any community or any sector that wants to learn and find new solutions, it has to be willing to look at information that disconfirms its past beliefs. Communities, organizations, and sectors that want to stay vital and relevant, they have to be able to search out for surprise, not just kind of wait for it to land in their lap, but actively to go seek it, to go seek that which conflicts with their worldview, to take on data and information that's uncomfortable, counterintuitive, maybe even shocking. And the challenge is to be able to integrate that. And that's the challenge that we have in the room this morning. And if there's one thing I love about the Nuffield organisation is that it consistently creates environments in which dialogue and consideration of issues of that type can happen and new solutions formed. And then, of course, there's a wonderful platform for sharing those solutions afterwards as well. So it is with this in mind that each of the panelists in turn will offer a short introduction to themselves and their perspective on the topic as it is laid out. I may have one or two questions of clarification for them, and then it'll be over to you. And it is your questions and your input that will determine our success in moving beyond greenwashing and developing solutions for a net positive agriculture. So with that, I'm going to turn to Helen as the first panelist on my left to offer that introduction, and then we'll go to Thomas, Gillian, and Kieran, and Kevin then as well, if he has been able to join us. Thank you.
thank you to the conference committee for inviting me to speak here today. So my background, I'm living in Dublin for the last 20 years. I work in UCD now, but I'm from a dry stock farm. Is that okay? Is that better? Is that better?
Can you hear Helen?
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm from a dry stock farm in Longford. I'm really a displaced Longford woman for most of my life at this stage. And I've become one of those annoying siblings that drop in at the weekend and then go off on their merry way on a Sunday evening again. So I currently have 3 siblings farming. In terms of my perspective on this whole topic, I guess I get quite concerned when I hear one-dimensional discussions on something that's so complex as sustainability. If we look at it purely on an environmental sustainability perspective, we have a climate and a biodiversity crisis. We hear quite a lot about the climate crisis. We don't hear so much about the biodiversity end of things. And I guess I think that if we're really to address the issue of environmental sustainability, we need to ensure that we're listening and we're hearing the different perspectives around the table. We need to have those different perspectives represented, and we need to be ensure that we're getting the full picture. If we look at things in one dimension and try to build solutions around that in terms of addressing one issue, we can very easily that approach can lead to unintended consequences and I guess potentially exacerbate other environmental issues. And then the same thing applies if we're talking about wider sustainability, where we need to take into account, you know, the social and the economic sustainability of our systems. So of the discussions that are ongoing, it does concern me when we talk only about emissions. That's not to say that I don't think those discussions are very necessary and that we absolutely need to address a reduction in emissions, but we need to do it in the context of the full picture. We need to take on an understanding of the other issues that are at play. We need the issues are complex. We need many voices around the table. Those voices must also be willing to listen and to understand and to try and, I suppose, put themselves in other people's shoes if we're to try and develop solutions that will truly address issues around sustainability, not just environmental sustainability. I was at the closing conference of the SUES project yesterday. SUES was an EIP in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains. And one of the comments that was made during the discussion panel there was, if we listen to each other, we probably would realise that we're in agreement with about 80% of what each other is saying. If we could actually forget about the bits that we don't agree on, stop focusing on those for a while, and get on with the 80% that we do agree on, then we can start, I suppose, building the relationships, building the trust that's needed to tackle maybe some of the more challenging areas. So, you know, in terms of my perspective, I would like to see that happening, that we could start working on that 80%. And not just start working, we are working on it, but to, you know, continue to progress that 80% that we probably all accept will need to happen. Okay?
Great stuff. Thank you, Helen. Thomas.
Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Duffy. So I suppose days when I'm not wearing a suit, we try to milk about 100 dairy cows in East Cavan, which, if anyone is familiar with the area in Virginia, is not very representative of Cavan because it's dry, which is quite nice, although it's very stony. So occasionally I get to see my farm, but these days, so I just spent 2 years well, not Jesus, time does fly actually now. It's a year, more than a year since it. But I was president of Mocker na Firma for 2 years, and I'm currently serving. I'm about 1.5 ways through my term as the CEJA vice president. So, essentially for my entire adult life, I've been involved in policy direction, and particularly in lobbying. First through MOCRA, now through CEJA. So someone pointed out to me one day, for a 30-year-old, I'm quite cynical, unfortunately. Although I prefer to say that for a pessimist, I'm quite optimistic, because there is a certain level of cynicism when you are working in policy for as long as you have, because very often you see really good examples of changes that can be made that run into, in some cases, natural barriers, and in some cases, entirely constructed barriers that are just deeply, deeply frustrating. And it is very, very hard sometimes to have to put up with that. I always start, whenever I'm talking to a room full of environmentalists or with a heavy environmental benefit, I will focus first on the challenges that affect farmers. But given that this is a room essentially of farmers, we're all fairly familiar with most of those. So I think maybe we should start with highlighting exactly where we are, and as Helen has touched on it, we are on track to break 1.5 degrees of warming. Most likely we will be looking at about 2.2. For everyone in this room, that means a massive cost. For everyone in this room, that means a lot of the people who buy our product will not be able to afford to buy our product in the future. We sell a lot of product to countries like Africa. They're warming and they're getting it harder. Their economic growth is slowing as a result of that. We will likely have to invest in drainage and flood defences for some parts of the country, and in many other parts of the country, particularly those of you from the southeast, will be looking at irrigation if we hit that 2.2 degrees. That is the situation that we are in. That is not a question, that is the track that we are currently on. We're becoming increasingly despondent around that, about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. In terms of biodiversity, we are seeing massive declines in species which we rely on in reality for farming and for agriculture. We are seeing increases in common species like crows and others as a result of the changes that we are making to the landscape. We are seeing reduction in pollinators, which will drive up the cost of crops. I say all this not to be entirely despondent, because there are ways, and we have successes that are currently going on, but there are also massive challenges that we need to say, okay, we start with, these are the challenges that we need to face, now how can we address them? And very often the issue around policy, environmentalists shout about that, and when we say, okay, but here are the economic and social barriers to that, it's dismissed. So, right, they're the environmental challenges. We look at farming in terms of a social aspect. Well, we have a generation renewal problem, a massive one, which is totally underestimated. In Mocker, we often talk about the fact that there are more over 65s than there are under 35s. I'm going to horrify people now, because that figure is completely out of date. That census is from 2016. We have no idea how the last cap affected generational renewal, because the EU Commission didn't do any assessments of it. Generational renewal was one of the priorities, and when there was political turnover, it essentially slipped way down the agenda and no longer seems to matter anymore. And that's terrifying. We had an increase, thankfully, through very heavy lobbying to increase the amount of money going towards generational renewal, but we had no major increase in Ireland. We're at about where we are in terms of the total percentage of cap money going towards that. So we have an ageing farming population. Then we look at the economics. We have only one sector which Teagasc assesses as being a high level of viability across the entire sector. We have two in the forms of both pig and poultry this year that are really on their knees and really struggling with increasing costs. We have dairy, which is doing reasonably well. We have tillage that for the last 2 years has been improving at least a little bit, but way below where it needs to be. And we have a beef and sheep sector that is struggling in the long term over the last 2 decades. So those are the economic challenges. So in terms of trying to meet our environmental challenges, we often have to make major changes in practices, which is hampered by the lack of generational renewal, because it is more difficult to change your practices when you've been doing something consistently for 40, 50 years. It doesn't mean you need a young person to do it. There are a lot of people in the sector who are well over the age of 35 and implementing new practices. But in terms of changing an entire sector, it gets more challenging the older the sector gets, and that's what's happening with agriculture. In terms of economics, we have two sectors that simply cannot afford to make any changes. They can't afford to make large investments. They can't afford to change practices because they're already financially at risk. And we have a policy framework at the moment which doesn't really enable those changes even if we wanted to. And on top of that, we have excellent research and development that often doesn't get down to farmers. Knowledge transfer is a major challenge, and particularly in those two sectors, I have to say. Dairying and tillage and the intensive sectors are a bit more engaged, but the problem is if you're already losing money, you don't really feel like making changes to your practices, which is a bit backwards, but that's the reality of the despondency in those sectors. So we have all of this going on simultaneously, and I know that sounds very doom and gloom, but we do have real great opportunities for the sectors, and there are simple things. And the challenge, the thing I find very frustrating as a farmer and agriculturalist with an environmental bent, if you want to call it that, is that so much of what we need to be doing is known by the farming community. We can't get environmentalists to listen. And maybe so much of what we need to do from an environmental point of view, we can't get many farmers to listen. Just from the last panel alone, Jesus Christ, I'm never buying another big brown egg. I'm going to only buy small white eggs, because it obviously makes sense to do that. But how many environmentalists will be aware that that would have such an impact? And then they get all het up about, let's be honest, protein sludges being produced by cell-based agriculture or lab-grown meat, which I'm extremely sceptical of, being this great, grand white whale that's going to solve anything. And a lot of them are not aware that we could just make very small changes to the practices and what we're doing and achieve very big outcomes. When we look even at a simple one, again, it's not overly focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, but we know the range in dairy production, we can now achieve 0.76 CO2 emissions in an LCA. That's lower than soya. That's lower than soya milk. So if we can shift as much of the sector towards that, we could undermine the entire basis for shifting to plant-based milks. We can't beat the potato milks because they're 99% water, unfortunately, and they're basically nutritional. Terrible. But we can. Anyway, I think I've taken up enough of the time at the moment. If there are any questions, I'll yield the floor.
Thanks ever so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm Gillian O'Sullivan, and I'm first and foremost, I'm a dairy farmer. I'm farming outside Dungarvan with my husband Neil, and my father's there as well. And we are milking about 100 cows on a once-a-day system for the last number of years. And to set the scene, maybe 15 years ago, over 15 years ago now, I graduated from UCD as a vet. And in my mid-20s, I would have been living in Dublin for, we'd say, about 8 years. I was working as a small animal vet there, and my level of interest, concern, or activism around environmental issues was non-existent. Like, let's call a spade here. And so as I'm sitting here in front of everyone today, it's clear there's been a kind of a road to Damascus type conversion that has occurred along the way. And I guess the catalyst to all of that was that my brother, who was farming at home with my father, my brother Vincent was 27 and he died suddenly at the end of 2008. And looking into 2009, we were left with quite a significant hole in the shape of Vincent on the farm. And during that year, during 2009, so Neil convinced me to get married, and I convinced him to give up his job as a veterinary surgeon in Clontarf and to come and go dairy farming. And given that Neil is not from a farming background, and also he's a very lovely man, so we know who got the short end of the straw in that deal that year. And our approach to dairy farming, we were coming from a very, very low knowledge base. And although my father was there and he was a wonderful help to us to help us learn in the beginning, when we started, our approach to learning was the exact same as we had learned in the process of becoming vets or even working as vets. And that was, if I had to do a surgery on a small animal, I would go to the most up-to-date resource that would tell me best practice on how to do the surgery, steps 1 to 10. I'd follow steps 1 to 5 and hope steps 6 to 10 works out. And that's how we set about farming. And I guess when we consumed for dairy farming, we consumed as so much conferences, resources, best practice, and we went and put our hearts and souls into it. And what we learned very quickly was that dairy farming was based around 3 core elements, and that was the cows, and they were the engine of the system, the grass, which was the fuel for the engine, and the dairy farmers who made decisions around that to tie it all together. And I guess over the years, though, what has changed, and this is all about perspective, because Nuffield is perspective is everything. What has changed in our perspective over the years is that, so we've moved from, education and learning, like both of us are so passionate about. We've taken on various courses, visited farms, traveled. We've done everything to continue our education and keep that best practice thing going. And what we learned over the years, and as our knowledge breadth deepened, it's one thing that wasn't adding up all the time. The first thing that kind of didn't start add up was that we had the whole farm soil samples, and we're looking at our soil samples, and it was, pH was in the right range. Our indices for P and K was bang on. So why weren't we growing as much grass as research farms or other farms in our discussion group? And we were scratching our heads, and this was like, well, and it took us a while to figure out. It was because our soil type was different to everyone else. We had shallow, stony soil that was south-facing. And the funny thing was, even after visiting so many conferences and reading all this material, the only thing I had learned about soil was that there was heavy soil, and there was dry farms. That was it. That was the extent of what I knew about soils. So I was like, okay, right, soils is a big deal to do with growing grass. And then the next thing we learned was that water and the presence or absence of water. So in the case of a waterlogged field, or in the case of a drought, water had a very significant impact on grass growth. And then the next thing we learned was that air had quite a significant impact on grass growth, because if you compacted the soil and squeezed all the air out of it, then you were going to impact on grass growth. We all know this. And then the last thing more recently we figured out was that, well, the both above ground and below ground biodiversity on the farm affected the quality and the type of pasture that we grew and the amount of pasture that we grew. So, whether that was, the different species above the ground, and again, the type of and number of species below the ground in terms of the microorganisms and all these things that are involved in nutrient cycling that we knew very little about, that these are very, very important. And basically that, to come back to the cows, grass and farmers, our perspective changed to being, so we are, the cows are still a core element, but now we're managing air, soil, water, and biodiversity in order to grow grass, or in order to produce the fuel for our cow herd, and as always, where the farmers making decisions around that. And why that perspective shift, which took a long time for us to come to terms with, but why that perspective shift is so important is because if grass growth is your goal, then the means to achieving your goal are very much justified. Whereas if we put our farm's natural resources in in our air, soil, water, and biodiversity as a means and a framework in order to grow our grass, well, that really, really, locates our decision making within the context of the farm that we're on, because every farm in the country is different. We all know this. There's 130,000 different farms in the country with 135,000 different ways of doing something in farming, and the soil types and range are all of these things are very much different across every farm. But if we make our decision making around how we produce milk, and we run it through that framework, it very much locates our actions within the context of our landscape. And that's really, really important, because it's important because environmental actions are not embedded in farming culture here, production is. And when we can find a way of embedding environmental actions within the farming culture, I think that's going to be a key thing in moving forward in the next 5 to 10 years. Look, I'll probably end on that and pass it on to Kieran.
Hi, everyone. Kieran Duggan is my name. Unlike these very impressive people here, I'm an expert in nothing. I'm something of a jack of all trades. I started out my life. I took over the farm from my dad pretty much when I was 19. and he brought me off and bought me 40 springers. We had never milked at home. I'd never milked a cow, and I stuck at that for 10 years and managed just about at the end of the 10 years to get out from under the banks. Sold the cows, and myself, my brother, my mum grew a golf course on the farm. We didn't build it, we grew it. That worked reasonably well for about another 10 years. Myself and my wife had a whole bunch of kids then, and they were driving us mad. So, or actually they were driving her mad. So I got to have them drive me mad for 5 or 6 years, and then I started a business with my friend, and we spent about 10 years trying to convert silage plastic, wrap plastic into water pipes and refuse sacks. That was where Geoff fell across me first, back in quite a while ago now, Geoff. That eventually that didn't work, and I've spent the last 10 years reassessing. Went back to the farm. I do a bit of social farming. I forgot to mention I planted most of the farm we had left. I planted it in forestry back 25 years ago now, and couple of years ago then, after all the kids and my wife had gone through college, they had decided to send me to college, and I should be at home writing my second dissertation from my second master's now. So as I say, a jack of all trades, a master of none. Part of that journey, I did my Green Cert back in 1989, and then in 1991, the education officer in Kildare, who had persuaded me to do the Green Cert, changed his role, and he became Teagasc's first environmental officer, and he ran an experimental course for farmers on this new environmental sort of stuff. And one of the things he did was he brought us to a farm outside Naas, and a calf to beef farm outside Naas, and brought us to show us the sward, and to show us what was good in the sward and what was bad in the sward. And I had to remind him that 2 years earlier I had been stood in the same field with him on the same grass, and he was showing us what was good and bad, and it was the direct opposite. So so 30 years ago, this sort of new idea of looking at how the environment affects our farming and how we affect it. I remember going home that evening and thinking, actually, this feels right. This feels better than in encouraging what wants to come anyway. Felt better to me than trying to discourage that and encourage Italian ryegrasses and stuff like that. And that felt better to me. So I became more and more interested in the environment and how we do things. How we feel matters. Most of what we do and what we talk about is coming from the head, and how we can stuff the pocket, but we've forgotten, I think, a lot of the connection that we have, and the connection that we all feel with the land, with our neighbours, with the people, and with all the biodiversity that's out there. I think we should do the right thing, whatever we think the right thing is at any particular moment. I don't think we should always be waiting to be paid to do the right thing, or we'll do the right thing if we're paid to do it. I think we should do the right thing anyway. And my experience, particularly in the last decade I gave up chasing the money, and I started doing the right thing. And funny enough, the money has begun to follow me, by doing the right thing. And I think looking at it broadly, I say, let's do the right thing.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Kevin, good morning to you.
Everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah. Speak again, Kevin.
Hello, testing.
Yes, that's
one,
really good.
two.
That's really good.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Geoff, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I wish I could be there in person, but thank you for allowing me to participate from Chicago virtually with you all today. I'd like to start by saying, and this isn't controversial for those of you in the room there, but to some people it is a surprise that agriculture is a solution to some of the world's biggest challenges, not the least of which is climate change. We know that dairy is a major force for good in the world. According to FAO's own statistics, 6 billion people around the world rely on dairy as an important nutrition source. And we in the dairy industry certainly believe that everyone has the right to wholesome and nutrient-dense food. New estimates are that 1 in 2 children, 2 in 3 women have at least one micronutrient deficiency, and many have multiple. Healthy diets, including dairy, can protect against some of these non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cancer, stroke, and the like. In addition to those nutritional benefits, the dairy sector also supports economic growth and builds strong, resilient economies and can transform the lives of individuals and communities. Just a couple statistics to support that fact on a global basis. 600 million people live on dairy farms. Another 400 million people rely on the full-time jobs that the dairy sector provides. There are 133 million dairy farms around the world, 37 million of which are led by women. Dairy provides 240 full-time jobs, 80 million of which are held by women. So when you talk about female empowerment, the dairy sector certainly delivers on that regard. However, if we're honest with each other, I think we all realize that dairy, like all agricultural sectors, has more work to do when it comes to our impact on the environment, which is why last year the global dairy sector started a new initiative called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. It's the first global initiative of its type in the world in agriculture. It brings together dairy farms of every size and of every scope all over the world, as well as organizations throughout the entire dairy supply chain. It is backed by nearly 140 governments, academic institutions, and dairy companies, including all 10 of the world's largest dairy companies in the world. Supporters already represent more than 40% of global milk production. We believe that by optimizing productivity, and productivity matters more than I think a lot of people will give us credit for, reducing emissions, our efforts today will safeguard nutritional security and sustain 1 billion livelihoods for tomorrow. So I look forward to this discussion today, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all. So there's a couple of things I want to do. I just want to pay a little bit of attention with the panel on maybe the baseline scenario, and then maybe just on the problem we're seeking to solve. So we're just going to discuss that here, maybe just for a few minutes, and then I want you to digest what you've been hearing, and it's just over to you in terms of where you want to go from there. So first of all, on the baseline scenario, so anytime there's a sustainability strategy being developed, let's try and get as clear a baseline as we can. And I'm going to pick up, actually, Thomas, maybe on what you observed, and that is that 1.5 is, it's just not going to happen. It's going to be, I think you mentioned maybe a 2.2 degree warmer world. And also, just a couple of stats that I was, and again, we're aware of these. Just in terms of the Irish context, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture rose 3% in 2021. Over the last 10 years, they rose 19.3%. They've risen 15% since 1990. The EPA outlined that with existing measures, emissions are going to flatline between now and 2030. With additional measures, which includes that famous MAC curve and everything that's in the Climate Action Plan, and everything is perfect, so to speak, we might hit a 21% reduction, which of course is still short of the 25% reduction that we in Ireland are legally committed to. So they're just some figures. Also, Kevin, and I had the opportunity to meet Kevin at a conference in Amsterdam. I mean, one of the things I took away from that is that, you know, there is the net zero pathway for the dairy sector. And my recollection, Kevin, is that globally, dairy emissions, if you like, in absolute terms, have risen 18%, is the most recent data available, albeit emissions intensity factors are falling. So this is the situation that we're coming from. And my question to the panel is, in the context of the topic that we have, are we engaged in rampant greenwashing, even in this panel today? I mean, what's our responsibility here? Are we complicit with this, you know, acknowledging that the targets that are there, what we're legally obliged to meet, you know, it's just looking a bit unlikely. And here we are, you know, having this conversation. So I'd just like to get a comment from everyone in the context of the conversation we're having. Are we greenwashing? And in any order. Who'd like to take it up first?
Look,
Gillian,
I'll start,
thank you.
but not in the context of there's a little bit of rebalance to come yet. Because let's say in terms of the research is coming in getting a tier 2 emissions factor for Irish cows. So at the moment we're using a tier 1 factor which is a global estimate of methane production from an Irish dairy herd, and we are. So research has shown so far that is overestimated. So there's if we look at that top line figure that we're all basing our emission reductions to, our 25% off. So that's in around 22 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, and we've to bring it down to a little above 17 is my understanding. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I'm no climate scientist.
No, yeah.
Now, so if we bring in this tier 2 emission factors, which is the emission factor from cows for methane in an Irish context, if that comes in, there's going to be a rebalancing there, and we have to remember that our 25% brings us to that figure of 17 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So if that is okay, there's going to be a little bit of debate around how this change in emission factor is going to, and it's not going to be straightforward, because there's going to be a little bit of maybe hurling around the edges about how this is implemented. Because let's say it's put in retrospectively, and this is now your new total, and now we apply 25% emissions factor to it. Well, we're talking about a totally different playing field now. Things go from being achievable to being, maybe completely beyond reach. So if that figure of 17, a little over 17 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, if that is an okay figure now, then we should implement our tier 2 factor when it comes in, once it's peer reviewed. But the science is very, very robust on it. It has to go through the peer review process. It has to be assessed by the EPA, taken on board, and then it'll be applied. But as I said, if that should be applied, and we should, move closer to the target that we want. But that's just as a precursor.
Thank you, Gillian. Okay, so there's something there about, our accounting measures, and of course that they're peer reviewed and that we can't stand over them. Other comments? I'm just curious as to what your thoughts, panelists, are coming in this morning with regards to our complicitness in greenwashing.
So in terms of are we greenwashing, every sector is participating in some level of greenwashing. That's just a reality. I mean, there is nothing more goddamn frustrating for me than walking through an airport and Dublin has a climate neutral airport. Like that's laughable. Like that's incredibly unbelievable. And I see the same thing about this is a climate neutral diesel or petrol. No, it's not. No, it's absolutely not. I mean, that's just con artistry. Sorry, I probably shouldn't say that legally, but anyway. But it's incredibly frustrating, and it's actually one of the few things that I would 100% agree with the environmentalists on across the board. That is not true. When we get to agriculture, it does get a bit more complicated, right? Because we have two things going on. One, if we didn't reduce the intensity, that 18% increase in dairy emissions would be massively more. And we have to remember that, and with relatively little fanfare, which I'm really disappointed at, 2 days ago we hit 8 billion people, right? Just in my lifetime alone, and I'm not incredibly old, I'd like to think, although these days I feel like it when I attend Mocker events, we have increased. We passed the 7 billion, now we're past the 8 billion. Right, we're already talking about populations declining because the continent of Europe, fertility is declining, the number of children is declining. So in my lifetime, it's predicted that I will begin to see population decrease again past 2050, which will take a huge amount of pressure off the entire planet. But between now and then, we are likely to hit 9 or maybe 10 billion. How we do that while still trying to achieve as many of our climate goals does require us to invest heavily in reducing the intensity, but also in reducing total emissions, which is the challenge that we have to now face. Now, just one thing I will say, because it's really important when we do talk about the fact that we're going to miss 1.5, the next target is not 2. The next target is not 2.2. The next target is not 2.5. The next target is 1.51. The next target is 1.52. We need to stay as close as possible to 1.5 and potentially even pull carbon down out of the atmosphere after that. Agriculture does have a role massively to play in this, but we also have to be cognizant of 86% of emissions are coming from fossil fuels, including within agriculture. Everyone here that has a tractor burns fossil fuels. Everyone here that turns on a light in Ireland is burning fossil fuels to do that. The cooling for our milk is fossil fuels. All of it is fossil fuels ultimately. Even in terms of methane, and there is a very big focus, and rightfully in Ireland, because we have a very large section of our greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, but globally, methane emissions, 33% of methane comes from fossil fuels, 30% comes from agriculture, and another additional, I think it's about 18 or 20% come from rice paddy fields, particularly, and other forms of plant-based agriculture. So methane is the biggest one because that's where the major cut needs to come in order to really reduce it. The first place that we need to look is plugging leaks in terms of fossil fuels.
Great stuff. Other panelists, are we greenwashing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kieran,
Yes. Yes. We are. As I said, my attention was drawn by Teagasc's research to all this area back in 1991. We're still talking. We're 30 odd years talking. We're still talking. We're talking about offsetting. Complete load of rubbish. We actually have to start acting.
Appreciate that. Helen?
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to the current COP negotiations, I mean, that challenge is out there. You know, it has been said pretty clearly that we can't just keep talking about it. We have to start doing, and we have to start doing now. And that's why I say, do we have to sit and wait to get full agreement between every sector to where they're going to get there? Can we get the bits that we can agree on? Can we get those moving and accelerated and ensure that all of the efficiencies that have been identified are implemented in the best way possible on every farm in the country, as is appropriate to that farm and that landscape? So we absolutely need to do that. We need to get that urgency across. I think we're probably a little bit insulated from it here.
So we're complicit in this, I think you're saying, Helen.
Look, I think everyone in society is.
Okay.
I'm not,
Yeah.
It's not about finger pointing at
Yeah.
any particular group. I think it's human nature.
Okay.
And we've got to move on it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Kevin, your thoughts?
The only thing I would add to what's already been said by the panelists is that I think we are making progress. It is not perfect. It's progress, not perfection, but we're working on the challenge. So to your question about greenwashing, I would agree with the rest of the panelists. But in terms of agriculture, I would say dairy, we are tackling it on a local, regional, and global scale. And I think that's a good thing. We're working on it. We know, for instance, most of our emissions for the global dairy sector come from the developing world, 80% according to FAO. We need to help those countries where dairy production probably is going to continue to grow. We need to help them adopt best practices that have already been identified and developed in countries like Ireland. So progress, not perfection, would be the message I would add to it.
Appreciate that, Kevin. And just to before we go to the audience, what is the problem that we're looking to solve? Just starting with that problem. And what is the problem? And I want you maybe just to think about this in the context of what problem does the world need farming to solve? What's that problem?
I jump in?
Yeah, please do.
From my perspective, I think, well, what I would like to see is a farming that is economically viable, that can support, vibrant rural communities, that can in turn keep, the farming families are able to raise a family and do so in a viable manner. But that we do it within landscapes that, yes, produce food, and food production is central to farming, but also recognises that there's a range of other services and functions that our landscapes need to fulfil, that allows us to, have those landscapes that will capture and sequester and store carbon, that will filter and circulate water, that will ensure that pollinators are abundant within them, etc., that we can have that kind of a multifunctional landscape.
Custodians of the landscape.
Of which food production is a hugely important component, but it is not the only function. And some landscapes will be better suited, I guess, to higher levels of food production than other landscapes will be. We need to recognise that we don't need everywhere to be the same. We don't need everywhere to be semi-natural, for example.
Okay. So we don't need recipes necessarily.
No, but we need to suit the context of the landscape and what can be achieved there. And I guess that is the only way I see true sustainability coming out of this, that we recognise
Can I check,
those.
does anybody in the panel have a different view to Helen or an additional observation? Kieran?
I think the problem we need to tackle is in our heads. It's our collective and individual mindsets. I think that's the problem. All the rest will come. We have huge capabilities. We just have to change the way we're thinking about it.
Okay, no, appreciate that, because there is something about that to which this isn't a technical problem, or is it a people problem, and the extent to which it might be both. Any other observations from the panel on the problem that we're looking to solve?
Probably that we need to park dogma. Dogma is going to be, is probably at the moment is our biggest enemy. Like dogma in the sense of, on one side, you have the dogma of, well, we cannot achieve our emissions reductions without reducing the national cow herd. And on the other side, the dogma as well on the other side of, well, I cannot, a farm cannot reduce its cow numbers in order to meet emissions reduction targets. Like, both of these things are right in their own sense, but both of these things are equally wrong, and that's where we need to trade the common ground and just find that pathway forward. And for me, there are examples of where this can work. So it's just, if we park our dogma, because I've seen people, they're being interviewed, and I know that all of this dogma is highlighted and magnified when it comes into social media or media at large, that it comes down to the microphone going in front of the farmer. Well, are you going to reduce your cow numbers? And that instant feeling of, I'm not going to give an inch here because therefore I am on the other side or whatever. And it says if we were able to park the dogma, then we could there's a pathway forward.
Absolutely, no, appreciate that, because with dogma we get stuck and we can't move. Thomas or Kevin?
Yeah. Only to be honest, I think Helen summed it up quite well. And I think to achieve that is actually exactly that change in mindset. The only thing I would probably add to it, we need to start looking at cutting out waste first, because we have an efficient system, but damn, we still have a lot of wasted stuff. A simple one, and I'm just going to use this as an example because it's a minor example. The amount of diesel that's wasted overcutting hedges every year. Christ, like, guys skin hedges to the last. It's damaging for biodiversity. They cut them the minute that there's fruiting, which is going to affect the birds. You're wasting diesel, you're damaging your land, just quit doing it.
It's interesting. There's something about that, isn't there? That kind of idea. Ineffective in small things, ineffective in big things. Very often these things are a signal. Kevin, what's the problem we're looking to solve?
And again, this is from a global perspective, so I'll just bring this to the panel. I mentioned it earlier. Thomas mentioned it earlier. We just passed 8 billion people. We're on our way to 9 or 10. There are 800 million people in the world who are malnourished or hungry. I think the number one problem we have to solve is to feed those people.
Feed the world. Okay. Over to you, folks. And Bill has, so when you just might tell us who you are. Not everybody in the room knows everybody. So if you have a question, just tell us who you are. If you're a Nuffield scholar, great. And if you're from a particular company, whatever it is, or an organisation, just tell us as well. So I think we have our first question at the back of the room.
So, Karina Pearce, UCD and a Nuffield scholar. A really interesting discussion. So dairy accounts for about 40% of agriculture, Irish Ag's emissions. And the Food Vision report, dairy report, that was published in September and October does show a pathway to reduction of emissions between 1.4 and 2.1 megatons, which is dairy's contribution, if you like, to the emissions reductions. But to achieve this, we need to see an uptake of technologies at farm levels like we've never seen before, in terms of the number of technologies, the rate of adoption, and so on. I'd just like to ask the panel, what do you think needs to be done to support farmers or to expedite the uptake of technologies to move towards achieving the emissions reductions from dairy?
Absolutely critical question, because there's so much asked of farmers. I learned that in Amsterdam with you as well, Kevin. The onus is very much on the farmer to solve a supply chain, or if you like, a system level problem. What's needed to support farmers? Who wants to take that one? Helen, I sense you're about to go.
I think there'll be a whole range of things needed, and at different time points. I mean, certainly from an education perspective, we in UCD and every other educational institution have a role, an important role to play. But I think really we need to allow farmers to work together somewhat in a similar way to EIPs have worked particularly well, where we get groups of farmers working together to address particular challenges in areas. And to some degree, there's a bottom-up approach to deciding what can be implemented on my farm in a useful manner. What can we do to achieve, to target these challenges and achieve something? In addition, we've seen programs like the ASSEP program, where we actually invest time and energy in talking and meeting and explaining and listening to, and I know that's resource intensive, but it works, and I think that's going to be a key way that we will get these things rolled out, these measures rolled out onto farms and adopted at farm level. We really need to invest in that personal approach with people and get things moving.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Bottom up, people working together. Gillian.
That's a super point, but from Helen, and I heard it was Dr. Mike Ryan who was speaking last week of the WHO, and he said there's something. I quote him on this. He said there's something special that happens when you get research and scientific expertise, and that comes and meets local communities, local knowledge, and local innovation. And that's exactly what is embodied in the ASSEP program and in EIPs, because it is that guidance that comes from those who know, whose lives are based around research, and who know how to implement best practice in terms of getting good environmental outcomes. But it's just marrying that with the farmers and how they can implement that at farm level. Look at the ASSEP. You have 30 advisors, 190 priority areas, and already in 4 years, you're getting improvements in water quality. I mean, that's like, if we could scale up a program very, very quickly, and there's only 8 additional advisors that have gone on to that program of late, but if we could scale up that program, surely that there's again, it's that marrying of scientific expertise with local farmer knowledge, and all farmers need is just to be guided in the right direction. And with the ASSEP program, it's 3 simple areas they're working on. It's nutrient management, it's farmyard management, and it's landscape management. It's a simple program, just getting the right people on the ground has made it work.
Great stuff. I'm reminded of a famous quote from former US President Eisenhower, and it is that whenever I have a problem that I cannot solve, I always make it bigger. And just in terms of what I'm hearing from Helen and Gillian, there is that element, that this problem is huge. You need to make it bigger so that you draw more people in and have more involved, more people with skin in the game. Any other comments in terms of what farmers need from the panel?
Geoff,
yes, Kieran.
Very quickly. I know that there's no better group to respond to incentive than Irish farmers. If the industry in general can incentivise in the correct the directions, farmers will respond.
Okay, no, appreciate that. Next question. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thomas Hubert, business journalist with The Currency. I just want to bring together 2 points from the wider debate on greenwashing. First one is, I think big part of greenwashing is hiding part of your supply chain. Like I came here on an electric car that was sold to me as zero emission, but it's hiding the fact that we've outsourced steel production to China for decades and other countries, and we don't burn coal here anymore, but it's still embedded in that. And I think agriculture is guilty of that, you know, selling grass-fed milk, but actually we are feeding other things, soybean from Brazil, palm kernels, and hiding that from the consumer. I think that's part of the problem. And on the other side of that, we have one argument in the criticism of agriculture from environmentalists is to say that it's export-driven. And why is Ireland exporting infant formula to China? Is it the best way to feed a Chinese child? That's a strong argument from that side of the debate. And I think we're missing the EU as a space to work in that. I was wondering, is there any appetite to develop European supply chain? We have this geographical and regulatory space. Maybe that's my dual French-Irish background and the fact that Europe is my core identity, but we've said Europe is where we want to have the best environmental policy. It's where we want to really trade between each other as one country when it comes to trade, really. No borders whatsoever. The best farmer in Ireland can feed the customer in Germany because that's one market. Is there any appetite to say we're going to develop brands that are Irish feed going into, European feed going into European animals, sold to European consumers, and that's something that is within a space that has strong regulations, strong standards, limited food miles, those kind of arguments, and have something around that. Not getting out of world markets. If you want to compete, fair enough, but you don't have to force the consumer in the EU to indirectly buy soybean from Brazil, for example.
Okay, I appreciate the point, Tom. So something there about the regionalisation of markets to improve, let's say, I suppose, consumer insight in terms of what they're buying. Thomas, I'm going to direct that one to you, perhaps, first of all.
Yeah, if I thought at times the Irish policy end of things was frustrating, I really underestimated just how much. You have to learn an entirely new language. It's called Brussels speak. And all the documents are in that and everything else. I would be very similar to Thomas in that I would first identify myself as a European and then as Irish, because I believe we are part of a community of Europe, and that is fundamental to what we are. In Ireland, we are it's always up and down between us, ourselves and Poland, who's more pro-EU. But that's the reality. We're the most pro-EU country in Europe because we see the value of trading amongst ourselves. We need protein independence in Europe. France in particular has advocated this kind of approach of protein sovereignty. That is what we need to be doing. There may be times when it's beneficial for us to buy protein from outside of Europe, but that we should always be able to supply, and we are not able to supply in Ireland or in the EU. We are fundamentally dependent on protein crop importation. We don't need to be. We haven't put the proper policy incentives in place. And I will give credit to Ireland. Ireland's a little bit maybe ahead of the game in that we have the protein subsidy aid. I thought every country had protein subsidy aid until I began to actually discuss it. And countries that are actually better able to produce protein are not subsidised under their common agricultural policy to produce more of it, and which would drive down the price for us. I think there's a unique opportunity in Ireland, in particular, because we have so much ruminant agriculture. We have the ability to produce, we are reliant and particularly focused on producing cereal protein, which makes no sense because we have ruminant agriculture that are able to break down non-cereal protein sources. And whether we could invest better in the likes of red clover and in other forage protein crops. Countries like, not countries, but states like California, for instance, produce an entire hay market and export it to goddamn Dubai. And yet we have no internal forage market. There has been no effort made around that, and potentially producing a high protein feed to move that around the country to achieve the aims that we want to kind of focus on. Again, still staying within our grass-based system, but we generally accept that a forage-based system is the one that because if we go down the line of multi-species, we're no longer grass-based, we're going to be forage-based system. So yes, we absolutely do. It is a fundamental failure of our current policy direction that not enough focus is about re-internalising a lot of it. And I am personally very scared at the current policy direction from the EU that there appears to be an achievement of we will domestically reduce production, we will clean up and make it look better, we will switch more to organic. I have nothing against organic at all, but that is part of the challenge. And then just import it. Because simultaneously we have a policy direction of the farm to fork, Green Deal, reduce production, shift to organic, and then sign the Mercosur deal and bring in Brazilian beef, bring in more soya from countries that are deforesting, even though thankfully now with Lulu getting re-elected, it might reduce that.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, there's something there about shortening supply chains. Have you got a quick comment on that from your perspective, Kevin?
Yes, thank you, Geoff. I would just say regarding transparency in supply chains, many dairy companies have committed to science-based targets and have not only 2050 goals, but 2030 goals. So again, I think that is something that we are as a sector working on to become more transparent and share exactly what is happening within the entire supply chain.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. And actually, science-based targets do have the potential to bring real transparency to the market. And so I'm going to go to the back of the room. Yeah.
Tommy Heffernan, vet, Nuffield scholar. Fantastic discussion. Slight grenade, but if we look at greenwashing and we look at a pasture-based system, and we look at what we've achieved through efficiency, and I had a discussion with a farmer about this yesterday. If we think about, and this is, I suppose, my observational evidence as well, purely from the nutrition of animals, is the greatest greenwashing just because it's green doesn't make it good? Should we be more focused on soil? Should we be more focused on ecology? If we talk about biodiversity, if we talk about water quality, most of it comes back to soil health. And our current grazing strategies, while they're very efficient, they're not ecologically sustainable. And I'm just wondering what people's perspective is. Are we too focused, and where do you see monocultures, particularly over the next decade, if we're to be sustainable? Do we continue with them, or is there a dramatic shift needed to back towards soil biology? Because if you actually look at it, and I suppose people talk about it, and I'm making a statement now, I'm a real Nuffield, but if you look at regenerative agriculture and the principles of it, a lot of our biological human health can be linked right back there. And I think that's where the focus of farming could be in the future. So I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on it.
Appreciate that, Tommy. I'm going to go to you in this, Gillian, but I just want to offer a perspective. The Economist, which is a magazine that I have a subscription to, it is advocating for a much narrower focus in terms of what sustainability is. You know, if you look at the E, the environmental, the S, and the G, and it believes that we need a priority or a hierarchy of issues, because the conflation of the sustainability agenda across so many interdependencies means that it is going to fail. And it is suggesting and argues cogently that the E needs to be on top and that climate is the number one issue. But Gillian, I'm curious to know what you think.
As I said before, I think soil has been completely overlooked as being and it's, you know, it's played second fiddle, or not even been in the orchestra, to be honest. So we need to bring that to the fore. But we're just mentioning about, you know, the greenwashing and the value chain thing, and to bring it back to your point there, Tommy, as well. Like in the value chain, we have our processors, and we have one of our processors doing an incredible job with the Zero Farm C initiative down there in Carberry. And like, what's that? That's a collaboration between Carberry and Science Foundation Ireland company called Biorbic, which is the National Bioeconomy Research Centre. And so they've come together. They said, right, let's really think about what a farm that has that is carbon neutral. That's the target they've set themselves, to be the first carbon neutral dairy farm in the world, and that's one of the targets. So what does that farm look like? And they've set 5 kind of thematic areas that they're going to really focus on around renewables, life cycle analysis, around things like soil health, things like biodiversity, and implementing all of those across those 5 areas on that farm. And that creates a living lab for farmers to come and visit. And I can't stress how important it is that farmers come and see this in operation and see the practicalities of putting these things into action. When you mention, like, they're going to touch on all of those things around the soil health, like Tommy mentioned, soil is so important. As I said, it was one of those key light bulb moments for us on our farm. We were like, oh, goodness, we need to take much better care of that, because that point about, you know, how much carbon is in ourselves, we haven't a clue. We don't know. We've only just started measuring. You know, we can only talk about, yes, there has been the EPA has done measuring across the country, and Ireland is coming from a place of being in a really good position when it comes to carbon levels within our soils. But there is actually room for improvement there as well. So, you know, in terms of creating a pathway forward, that initiative that I spoke about from Carberry is fantastic. And in terms of greenwashing, if you look at on the other side of things, somebody just deeming or maybe a processor deeming a sustainability action payment as being a way forward of creating a sustainable future for farmers or sustainable actions, enabling farmers to take sustainable actions. I think that is the epitome of greenwashing. Because as I said to my children, if I gave you if I give you pocket money last month and then this month I say, well, a portion of that pocket money is now your college fund, and I just kind of absolve myself of ever having to deal with their issue of college education and say, there we go, and I feel all happy in myself, that's not meaningful engagement in moving this debate forward or enabling farmers in that space. And if processors move more towards the actions of Carberry, then we'd be in a better space again.
Okay, something there about the responsibility of the value chain. Any other comments from the panel on this?
I think, if I
Helen,
may,
please.
Look, I mean, everything begins with the soil. That's the fundamental basis on which we feed ourselves, and if we degrade that, or we carry out activities that are degrading that, then we're undermining that potential to feed ourselves into the future and to support all those other services that we've talked about. In terms of the work that we've been doing when we've shifted from monoculture to multi-species, and I stress that this is still at a relatively high intensity end of the scale. I'm not talking about species-rich grasslands here or anything. But we've shown over the last number of years at UCD Lyons Farm we can grow to, on average, 2.5 tonnes more dry matter with 40% of the fertiliser nitrogen out there if we use multi-species swards rather than ryegrass swards, ryegrass monocultures. Maybe there will continue to be a place for everything along that spectrum, but when we look at the multi-species, we have seen, there are challenges with them, but soil health appears to be improving. If you measure that through biological activity, for example, like earthworm populations, certainly we're seeing improvements there. We seem to be able to enhance resilience in terms of periods of climatic challenges. Animal performance is enhanced, where we're including legumes and herbs into swards. We're seeing animals reach target slaughter dates a month earlier than their monoculture counterparts. We've seen animal health improve, where we're using 50% less helmintics. So I think there's a real resource there that we have tended to forget about over the last 60 years because we had the bag or we had the injection on the shelf or whatever it was. Now we've got to start thinking, and I suppose people knew about it in the past. We've forgotten a lot of the information that was known. But it is up to us now to really look at that and see, what did people do before they had bagged fertiliser there? How did they manage their swards? How did they manage? And I know the expectations in terms of productivity might have been different, but how can we adapt what they did perhaps to meet our current expectations and using new technologies with it? So I think there's some really important lessons that we need to draw on there and adapt them to our current situation.
Thank you, Helen. So there's something there about, some easy solutions can make us lazy, like fertiliser, and maybe the solution is not so much staring us in the face, it might be under our feet. So I have a couple of questions coming up, 3 questions. So I'm going to start here, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to go here.
That's my name. I came from Galway yesterday, and happy is the
Sorry, so you would just wait for a microphone. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, then we go to you, Tim. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Pat's my name. I came from Galway yesterday, and they say happy is the individual that can enjoy the scenery while on a diversion. In response to this lady's contribution, I passed a farm that belonged to a family of rabbit, okay? And in former days, they grew sallies. They wouldn't bring the Clydesdale or the Irish Draft into the land because it would compress the soil. Now they gather stones because it's a stony environment off the land, made walls of it, great big walls, and then they spread the farmyard manure, collected the crops. So that's an answer to your observation. Let's take a look at the past to inform our present or our future.
Appreciate that input,
Yeah.
Pat. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
And there is something in that as well, isn't there? And sometimes, the new, if you like, the sexy solution can distract us actually from something that we knew for a long time. Thank you. So we go to this, yeah. So Tim, you might, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Tim O'Leary, I'm an elder Nuffield scholar, I suppose, at this stage, with all the young faces around the room. And to start, I'm a bit disappointed Oisin Coughlan wasn't here, because I think he might have brought another element to the discussion from a more extreme point of view. But that being so, a couple of points I'd like to make is that I think we forget what we're doing well sometimes. And I think authorities ignore what we're doing well sometimes. The current example I'd give you is that in the last EPA report on water quality, the areas of water that were in the ASAP programme that we spoke about earlier on have shown an improvement in water quality, whereas the other areas some of them showed a disimprovement. Yet when Laura Burke spoke about dealing with water quality at the end of that report, her solution was more inspections from local authorities, and she never mentioned the success rate or the success of ASAP. So when we are faced as farmers with a situation like that, where even when you do your stuff, and I'm in an ASAP area and I'm involved with what's being done, and you know, Gillian is spot on in her description of how it works. And when you have 15 or 20 farmers standing in a field, and all of a sudden the assessment is how you stop the sediment getting into the drain at the bottom of the field, and no one is talking about the tons of grass per hectare, or nobody's talking about the kilograms of milk solids, and all those farmers are focused. That's a system that's working, right? Now what happens, and what needs to happen, is that system needs to be praised first of all by the authorities that are measuring the outcomes of that system and recognised for what it's doing. That will give impetus and encouragement to more farmers to become involved and make it easier for them to step up and be involved in those programs. That's the way the system needs to work, that when you do something right, you get it right and you recognise it as being right. And until we come around to those sort of areas, the amount of work that's been done on health in this country under the radar in co-ops, with Cell Check, with Animal Health Ireland, and with the ICBF is phenomenal in what it is doing to improve the health status of our country. We hear very little or anything about it outside of the agricultural media. So those are issues that I think that when we sit down and we talk about how we're going to deal with climate change and how we're going to deal with biodiversity loss, those are issues that we need to remember, that we need to tell the world and we need to tell people what we are doing right. That makes it easier for us to do more right, because we get the recognition for doing it.
I appreciate that, Tim.
We can sit inside here in a room talking to ourselves, but until the people outside, like Oisin Coughlan, hear us talking, we're not going to make the progress we need to make. We've lost so much ground in the public perception in the last 5 years. We have, as an industry, we've lost a pile of ground. And the last comment I'd make was to Helen, is to how did people manage before the bag of fertiliser came around? And I'm nearly old enough to remember it, but I certainly remember it coming in. But I also remember when I started farming, I got half the price of the bottle of milk on the doorstep. I got half the price of the bottle of milk on the doorstep for the milk I produced. Today it's under 30% of the bottle of the carton of milk in the supermarket is what the farmer gets. So we have changed, our whole world has changed, and we can no longer have that comfort of low output per hectare or per cow because we were getting it in the price. Now the world wants cheap food. Now the EU policy is still cheap food. So that's, they're the issues we face. They're the issues. I don't want to be too negative here because we're doing lots of good stuff, but at the same time, we need to recognise the issues that we face as farmers in dealing with these.
No, appreciate that, Tim. I'm going to take that as a contribution. Is a burning observation? Yeah.
Yeah,
we're running out of time.
Yes, no, it's just one observation because Tim is right. But part of the problem was Laura Burke's comments got the headlines, right? That got the attraction. It got the spreading of those who are quite negative towards farming. But it also got farmers to click on it. Now, I listened really interestingly to the Radio 1 interview, so it was one of the first interviews that was done that day, and it was by their head of water research. And she, in like one of the early stages of the section, I can't remember who exactly she was talking to, whether it was Dobbo or Philip Beecher Hayes or someone, but she said, no, the ASIP worked. She highlighted that the ASIP worked. That didn't get any attention. Good news stories rarely get attention, unfortunately, and that's just the media landscape that we live in, because the people who and we're doing a bad job at articulating how good we are, but we need to be able to answer these things. We also need to be honest and say, yeah, we've got massive challenges in this sector, and this is how we're going to face it. From a policy point of view, the most frustrating thing is we know what works, we know ASIP works, so why the hell aren't we funding ASIP across the country? Why are we squandering money in places that really, in projects that have no guaranteed outcome when we know what works now?
Okay, great. So I'm building on those successes. Okay, appreciate that. Jim.
Chairman, my question for the panel is, do they believe, or do they think, or have they given any thought to the idea the most guilty parties to greenwashing are the European farming and environmental policy makers? And why I say that is that my name is Jim McCarthy. I'm a Nuffield scholar from the Bronze Age of Nuffield, Ireland. But I happen to farm in Romania and in Ireland. And I farm in Romania in what's called a water-restricted area, less than 550 millimetres of rainfall. Climate change is so relevant now to us because it so affects us so much. Let me give you an idea. 2021, we had average rainfall. 2022, we had a 40% reduction in rainfall. Our wheat yields were 50% of 2021 production. And we farm quite a substantial amount in organic. And our organic wheat was only 50% of our conventional wheat. The threat that organic farming is to food security is shocking. And the destruction of soils by organic farming. We grow row crops in Eastern Europe, and I love Gillian O'Sullivan's comment about the soils. We grow a lot of row crops, soybeans, sunflowers, corn, organically, and linseed. And we're growing them in row crops. And to control the weeds, we have to hoard them mechanically, and sometimes manually. And we're destroying the soil. Then it rains, we've all this loose soil, it's washed away, huge erosion, huge drops in soil fertility, huge organic matter. The land is, Don Rajkowski, the man who wrote the definitive work, Professor of Soil Science from Minnesota, on the carbon cycle, called ploughing the greatest act of environmental vandalism in farming. We, on the other side, grow soybean for Alex Evers conventionally, where we harvest our corn, we chop the straw, we seed the cover crop, we burn off the cover crop in the spring, and we no-till soybean, and it's a carbon sink. But our policymakers want to give us a farming system that's a great carbon emitter. The whole debate, this debate today could be stopped if the world was forced to go to no-till farming, that none of the arable land in the world was tilled, ploughed or tilled. It would become an enormous carbon sink. And the reason dairy farming is vilified is because of a number of NGOs who have this huge curse on livestock production. Arable farming is the answer to the problem to become a carbon sink, not a carbon emitter, but it fails to make the debate. There's a shocking lack of realization that in 2010, there was 0.197 of a hectare per person in the world. That has fallen, because of loss of land, through desertification mainly, and building, to, in 2020, 0.175 of a hectare, and that's dropping. And our greenwashers want us to go to a system of agriculture that is just so unproductive. Every farmer needs to give a chunk of their land to the biodiversity. They have to. And what are we trying to do? Create an extensive agriculture. We need to take 5 to 10% of our land, all of us, for biodiversity. Because that's the big issue, is the lack of biodiversity. Okay. Monoculture and lack of biodiversity. They're the big issues.
Okay.
And greenwashing by our policymakers.
Appreciate that, Jim. I just so look, there might be that large-scale single solution is what I'm taking from that, Jim. It could be no-till agriculture, and other observations as well in terms of how maybe policy, badly designed policy, sometimes gets things wrong. Comments from the panel on that? Anybody want to pick that up? And I am conscious of time as well, and we're going to move to a wrap-up shortly. Any comments on what Jim McCarthy just offered?
I'll be as brief as I can on it because I could talk all day on this one. Yeah, absolutely. There is a lack. I should have mentioned that actually I'm a former student of Helen, but
don't say that.
She won't take the blame for any of my opinions. Don't worry. But there was one of the courses that I think it was actually John Fry gave it to us, or John Finn, was talking about there is no absolute sustainability. Everything is trade-offs. So when you do something like you go to organic systems, yes, you decrease your synthetic inputs, you decrease your synthetic pesticides, and you increase your requirement for cultivation, which increases soil erosion and carbon loss. Flip side of that, you go to min-till. You have to increase the amount of pesticides in a lot of cases. Now, can we find trade-offs? Can we find new ways to do that? Yeah, possibly. And there are ways, and there are really frustrations in the farming community that many of the cutting edge of things is simply not aware of. We're currently involved in a discussion around NGTs, for instance, and the fact that many in the environmental community are just like, no, they're GMOs, we don't want to talk about them. And we had a great discussion where we were like, well, potentially we could reduce the dependence on irrigation, we could reduce dependence on fertilizer. These could be a way to do this. Would you be open to that? No, they're GMOs, we don't want to deal with them. And that was just shutting down the conversation, shutting down this discussion on that is just, it's entirely ideological. I am, though I will say to the room, I am very enthusiastic about the actual next generation of environmentalists, because while I don't always agree with the Greta Thunberg crew, very often they're actually a massive challenge for the older environmentalists. When you look at things like energy production, all of a sudden you've got young environmentalists coming out and goes, why shouldn't we have nuclear energy if it reduces climate change? And the older generation that are totally opposed to that are like horrified by this. But then Greta's coming out and going, yeah, why shouldn't we? We don't want to go back to coal. And the same thing, I think, could potentially happen if we as an agricultural community do things well and go and talk, sorry, I should have said new genomic technologies are things like gene editing and things, non-GMO techniques. I think if we educated a new generation of young people, particularly, got out there and said, look, this is the things that we want to do as a sector, push things forward, we could potentially have the same impact on that next generation of environmentalists, and they may challenge their seniors, because a lot of them are just as skeptical of reducing, but there is an oversimplified approach. We can either land spare, and that means land intensification, or we can go the land sharing route, or we can have a mix of that in the landscape. But if we follow a policy of land sparing and think that we can then rewild huge parts of it, we are going to starve people. That's the long and the short of it.
And in the middle of this, of course, I think, somewhere along the line, there's an issue of trust here as well, in terms of why policies are badly designed or why we might feel, why can't people see sense kind of thing. There is that issue. Maybe trust has been lost. Maybe, as a sector, perhaps we didn't do enough to cultivate that trust, to build that trust. There's a lack of confidence that we can provide solutions. I am conscious of time. I know Catherine has asked me to conclude. Is there a final burning question that somebody really has a question that they want to ask? Or if not, I'm going to go to the panel just for a final comment. I'll go to the panel then for a final comment. And look, this is kind of a neither-or question to all five of you. I'm picking up on the idea. We're doing a lot of stuff really, really well. We've got a lot of successes that we can build on. Perhaps we need to build some better data around that. And I'm picking up maybe on what Tim O'Leary offered there, so that we can tell that story. But just my question for the panel, this is an either or, you can take a both. What do we need to start doing and what do we need to stop doing? As a sector, you can maybe answer from any perspective that you wish to. It could be as a farmer or as a sector. What do we need to start doing and what do we need to stop doing? And you can take both or either or.
I can come straight in. We need to get out of our trenches and start talking without risk of start exploring, but get out of the trenches.
Appreciate that, Kieran. Get out of the trenches, start talking, and there's an element there of engagement, making the problem bigger, getting more people involved, that we don't end up carrying the burden alone. Who'd like to go next? Thomas, did I? Yeah.
We need to do two things. One, we need to actually start delivering. You're talking about loss of confidence in greenhouse gas emissions. We can't keep claiming that agriculture is improving if greenhouse gas emissions are reducing. So we need to, and then the second thing we need to do is we need to scale up the solutions that we have. I mean, Tommy had a good question about like how to implement this, or actually I think it was Karina's one on the dairy sector. We need to stop looking at the farmers as one simple group. They're not. Right? You have 20% of farmers that are early innovators. They will take up every new technology, be that multi-species. I mean, I see Martin Heaney and Joe Leonard here. When they started taking up multi-species, it changed a lot of attitudes because they'd say, well, they're not hippies. Do you know what I mean? To be fair to the two of them. And then the other thing we need to stop doing is we need to cop on a wee bit and stop wasting things. Like, again, whether that be fuel, whether that be... There has to come a cultural change. The odd bit of weeds in the corner of a field, Jesus, like there's nothing more undermining, I think, for the environmental crew and even the general consumer when we say, oh look, these are great environmentally conscious farmers, and then they go out to the farm and like it's sprayed underneath the ditches and it's sprayed underneath the wires and the hedges are skint to the last. Totally undermines the message. It's a killer. It's really a killer, and we need to stop defending those sort of things. Stop wasting resources is my.
Appreciate that, Thomas. Kevin, I'll just go to you next to bring you in.
Yes, thanks, Geoff, and thank you again for the invitation to participate. I love Tim's comment about we forget what we do well. We're just coming off of 2 weeks at COP27, the world's largest climate conference. And we were there along with other animal agriculture industries and sectors. This is to tell the story, and I don't really like that language because we're always told to tell the story, but it is that simple. We were at no less than a dozen different side events throughout those 2 weeks, and for the first time, agriculture was a major topic of discussion. And I think when we had those conversations with policymakers and others, and UN member states, they are literally surprised about the activity that has already happened, the progress that is being made. And I think we need to continue to talk about that. Certainly your point about better data will help us tell that story, Geoff. But I think we do a lot of things really well, and sometimes in these meetings we get down on ourselves. But unlike Thomas, I'm an optimistic optimist.
Okay, appreciate that, Kevin. Yeah, and of course it's telling that story. It's because it's telling it with honesty, isn't it? Being truthful about it. Yeah, and telling that. Helen.
I've lost my train of thought now. So when the MAC was published and Gary Lanigan's work around emissions reductions with implementation of MAC measures, there's an assumption made at linear uptake at farm level, and that's not happening. So that absolutely needs to happen. But we need to help and support people to do that. And we need to, have those kind of groups like ASSOP rolled out. We need to get that engagement with people and build that momentum through that kind of support network. And also we need to recognise that sustainability isn't one-dimensional. There's a whole lot of different dimensions to it, and we need to be very careful about the policies we put in place and the measures that we put in place, that they make sense for other elements of sustainability as well as greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, no, appreciate that. Helen, Gillian, stop doing and start doing.
So I guess firstly we need to probably start upskilling solutions that are already working, right? And Thomas touched on it there about so the signpost farms, again, 125 farms dotted across the country. The scheme has just started up. Now, the really important thing about the signpost farms is that they have really chosen excellent farmers that are the early adopters that you mentioned. They are real pillars within the community, and they're people that other farmers will look up to. And these farmers are so willing to open their gates to their farm and to bring people in to demonstrate what they're doing. And they're trialling all of the MAC measures and beyond that as well. And I think that if we could, if we could upscale the likes of the signpost farm program, we would get traction quite quickly, because, you know, let's say if even one discussion group was piggybacked with every signpost farm, that would move from 125 farms to 2,500 farms. And now we're getting significant ripple effect, because once you start getting these ideas being spread within farm communities, then you start to, you know, for those people that are not the early adopters, it starts to trickle down there. What we need to stop doing is waiting for technology to fix this, because there is no quick fix in this solution. It's just like dealing with mastitis. Multifactorial problems, you need multifactorial approach. We're not going to get anywhere waiting for the likes of 3NOP. I mean, you know, which is Bovaer. Why should we base our entire industry on one supplement? You know, I just don't see that as being something we should hold out for. We really need to get solutions that are already working. Look at what's going on in Solihull. They've already achieved 25% emissions reductions by dropping nitrogen out. And that's my last challenge to everyone. You know, it's to think that our monocultures of ryegrass that have high nitrogen requirements, are they the agriculture of 10 years' time? And I don't think they are. So we need to take that nugget on board and readdress how we farm in that context.
Thank you very much, Gillian. You know, there's so much in the discussion. There's an element, I'm just reminded in terms of what Gillian had said, you know, there's the question of, you know, well, what do we do next? But then there's also, I think, Gillian, you said, well, what do we need to prepare for in 10 years' time? That's part of what we need to take forward. You know, the other thing I'm taking from this is, in a sense, this should be a way easier than it is. You know, I have this sense of it. You know, I go to a number of environmental conferences, and there's always this sense of being stuck. We know exactly what we need to do, but for some reason we just can't do it. And I suppose the truth of it is, it would be, you know, everybody really wants to do the right thing. I think when you drill down, when you meet people for lunch afterwards or whatever it is, people want to do the right thing. And it's much easier to do the right thing if the law clearly requires it, if your customers are demanding it, and if your competitors are doing it. But we don't feel that we live in that kind of world where there is that level playing pitch and we get stuck and we're second guessing. And there's, in a sense, this giant game of global poker being played with the planet. And to a certain extent, we're part of that. Maybe other themes that we took, you know, the solution perhaps is under our feet as much as it's staring us in the face. Maybe we need to, you know, encompass the idea that we're custodians of the soil. What would that mean? What might that change? So much to take forward. And, you know, I suppose maybe linking back to the start as well, you know, the world needs us to stretch. It needs us to flex. It needs us to step away from the logic perhaps that we carried into the room, and we need to carry a different logic out of the room. You know, ultimately nothing is going to change until we change, and in that sense, you know, I suppose we can say we are the solution, and we have to carry that responsibility. We could apply that maybe fundamental truth to every problem we have. You know, it's not going to be technology. There isn't going to be that silver bullet. It does come back to mindsets. It comes back to us. So I want you to give a very big and hearty note of appreciation to our panelists, to Kieran, Gillian, Thomas, Helen, and Kevin. Thank you so